"I'll be your wife if you let me sleep here," the runaway bride said to a giant Apache. Torn veil, no shoes, dust in her throat, she wasn't begging. She was bartering. He didn't answer, just handed her a blanket and turned away. But what started as one desperate night beneath the stars soon draws the eyes of a town built on silence, stolen land, and secrets buried under floorboards. Now the church bell's about to ring, the noose is ready, and nobody knows what she's hiding or who she's come back with. When the dust settles, will the town still dare to call her Runaway? Every story begins with a heartbeat. Tell me, where are you in the world today, and how are you really doing? Your words make this space feel more human. Thunder rumbled across the Mogollon Rim as Charlotte Ray Wycliffe stumbled through the mesquite, her wedding dress catching and tearing on every branch. Her bare feet burned from the rocky ground, but she pressed on, clutching her wilted bouquet like a lifeline. Blood from her scraped palms stained the white satin ribbons that bound the flowers. Through the gathering dusk, she spotted a flicker of orange light. A campfire. Her heart leapt, then faltered as she drew closer. A tall Apache man sat beside the flames, his scarred face illuminated as he turned a spitted rabbit. The firelight caught the silver at his temples and the deep lines around his eyes. Charlotte's throat went dry. He was bigger than any man she'd ever seen, with shoulders broad as a barn door. A former warrior by the look of him. Her legs trembled, but there was nowhere else to go. The storm was coming and night was falling fast. "I'll be your wife if you let me sleep here," she blurted out, her voice cracking. The words hung in the air between them. The man's face remained impassive. Without speaking, he reached for a battered tin cup, filled it with water from his canteen, and held it out to her. When she didn't move, he set it on a flat rock near the fire, then unrolled a wool blanket and placed it beneath a gnarled piñon pine. Charlotte inched forward, snatched the cup, and retreated to the tree. The water tasted of metal and minerals, but she gulped it down. Wrapping herself in the blanket, she huddled against the trunk, watching him through the flames. He never looked directly at her, just continued tending his rabbit with careful movements. She must have dozed, for when she opened her eyes again, dawn was breaking over the rim. Her body ached from sleeping on the ground, but she was unharmed. The man, her host, was already up, adjusting the cinch on a paint horse's saddle. Without a word, he helped her mount, then led the horse down a series of switchbacks cut into red dirt cliffs. Charlotte expected him to guide her toward town, but instead they came upon a small adobe building with a cross mounted above its door, a mission school by the look of it. A woman emerged from the building, neither fully Apache nor fully Mexican, with kind eyes and a determined set to her jaw. This was Elena Garza, though Charlotte didn't know it yet. The woman took one look at Charlotte's torn dress and bleeding feet, and her expression softened with understanding. For the first time since fleeing her own wedding, Charlotte felt the iron bands around her chest loosen. Here, in this humble schoolhouse with its unlikely keeper, she might find sanctuary after all. Morning sunlight streamed through the schoolhouse windows as Elena ladled steaming porridge into earthenware bowls. The simple kitchen, with its rough-hewn table and herb bundles hanging from the rafters, filled with the comforting scent of cinnamon and honey. Charlotte wrapped her hands around the warm bowl, now dressed in a borrowed calico dress that hung loose on her frame. "You need to eat," Elena said gently, settling into a chair across from her. Taklishim sat silently at the far end of the table, his presence as steady as the mountains outside. Charlotte stirred her porridge, gathering courage. "I ran because it wasn't just about marriage," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was about land. Always about land." Elena's dark eyes softened with understanding. "The Hartleys have been trying to expand their holdings for years. My father," Charlotte's voice caught. "Pastor Wycliffe had a stroke 3 weeks ago. He can't speak, can barely move his right side. My Uncle Timothy came from Phoenix to help, but..." She pressed her lips together, fighting tears. "He arranged everything with Joshua Hartley in secret." The wooden spoon trembled in her hand as she continued. Yesterday morning, before the ceremony, I went to the church early to pray. I heard them in Father's study, Joshua and my uncle. They were talking about my dowry, but not about money. About a Spanish land deed hidden under the church pulpit. Elena exchanged a meaningful look with Taklishim. Bitter Creek's water rights, she said quietly. The deed would give the Hartleys control of the water flow between the reservation and the railway's planned route. Joshua said it was convenient that Father fell ill when he did. Charlotte's voice turned bitter. That's when I knew I couldn't go through with it. I wasn't a bride to him. I was just a way to claim the land. The Hartleys have been pressuring every homesteader and mission in the territory, Elena explained, rising to pour more coffee. The railway surveyors arrived last month, marking routes. Whoever controls the water controls where the tracks go. Taklishim spoke for the first time that morning, his words careful and measured. The reservation depends on Bitter Creek. Without water rights, my people will be forced to move again. The weight of what she'd stumbled into settled heavy on Charlotte's shoulders. This wasn't just about her freedom anymore. It was about the lives of hundreds. The day passed slowly, with Elena teaching Charlotte the rhythm of mission life. They fed chickens, helped young students with their letters, and prepared meals for the handful of children who boarded at the school. Taklishim worked quietly in the garden, but Charlotte noticed how his eyes regularly scanned the horizon. As the sun began to set, hoofbeats approached. Elena's son, Mateo, a lanky boy of 14, galloped into the yard on his pinto pony. His face was flushed with urgency. "Mama!" he called out, jumping down before his horse fully stopped. "The Hartleys have posted rewards all over town. $500 for anyone who brings Miss Wycliffe back." He caught his breath, adding, "They're saying she's distressed in mind from her father's illness." Charlotte felt the blood drain from her face. Elena quickly ushered them all inside, bolting the heavy door. "They'll try to paint you as confused or sick," she said grimly. "It's how men like Joshua Hartley operate. They make women doubt their own minds." That evening, while Elena tended to a student fighting fever in the dormitory, Charlotte couldn't sleep. She slipped outside to find Taklishim sitting by a small fire behind the schoolhouse, carefully carving a piece of fragrant juniper wood with a small knife. The firelight caught the silver threads in his black hair, and his hands moved with practiced precision over the wood. Charlotte settled on a log nearby, watching the shavings fall. "I need to apologize," she said softly. "When we met, I offered myself like I was property to be traded. I was desperate and afraid, but that doesn't make it right." Taklishim's hands stilled on the carving. He looked at her directly for the first time since that night, his dark eyes reflecting the flames. When he spoke, it was in Apache, his voice low and firm. "Kad ti do nahida da." Then, seeing her confusion, he translated, "You are not for sale." The simple statement, spoken with such quiet conviction, brought unexpected tears to Charlotte's eyes. She blinked them away, watching the sparks rise toward the star-filled sky. In the distance, a coyote called, and another answered, wild and free, belonging to no one but themselves. Dawn painted the desert sky in shades of pink and gold, as Elena helped Charlotte pack a worn leather satchel. The mission kitchen was quiet, except for the soft clink of tin cups and the scratch of Elena's pen as she wrote a letter on faded paper. "This says you're delivering primers and chalk to the mission at Fort Apache," Elena explained, folding the letter carefully. "If anyone stops you, you're a teacher's assistant making a supply run." She pressed the paper into Charlotte's hands. "Keep it safe." Charlotte tucked the letter into her borrowed riding skirt. Outside, Taklishim waited with 2 horses, his own dark stallion, and a gentle paint mare for Charlotte. He'd already secured their provisions and a bundle of actual school books for authenticity. Elena embraced Charlotte tightly. "God go with you both," she whispered, then stepped back to watch them mount up and ride east toward the rising sun. The morning air was crisp as they followed a narrow trail through stands of juniper and pinon. Charlotte's mare proved sure-footed on the rocky terrain, though her muscles ached from the unfamiliar movement. Taklishim rode slightly ahead, his posture alert as he scanned their surroundings. By midday, the landscape changed. The trail descended into a valley where a creek bed lay dried and cracked. Near its banks stood the blackened remains of a homestead, its timber frame reaching toward the sky like scorched bones. Charlotte reined her horse to a stop, staring at the ruins. "What happened here?" she asked softly. Taklishim drew his horse alongside hers. "Water fights," he said simply. 3 months ago. Family wouldn't sell to the cattle barons." His words hung heavy in the air, speaking volumes about the violence simmering beneath the surface of their territory. They made camp that evening beneath a towering red rock formation that offered shelter from the wind. While Taklishim tended the horses, Charlotte gathered wood for a small fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on the stone as they shared a simple meal of cornbread and dried meat. Charlotte watched her companion's profile in the firelight. His silence, which had first unnerved her, now felt companionable. Still, questions burned in her mind. "You speak English well," she ventured carefully. "Better than most in these parts." Taklishim added a stick to the fire. "Was Army scout," he said after a long moment. 7 years. "But you left?" His jaw tightened. "Saw too many promises broken. Treaties made, treaties forgotten. My people moved like cattle." He fell quiet again, but Charlotte sensed there was more to the story, pain buried deep. "What does your name mean?" she asked gently, changing the subject. "In Apache?" For the first time, she saw the hint of a smile touch his eyes. "Taklishim," he said. "Black oak, strong tree that grows in high places." Charlotte smiled too. "It suits you." The next afternoon found them approaching a railway work camp nestled in a valley. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and the ring of hammers on steel carried across the distance. They needed grain for the horses, and Taklishim had traded at this camp before. "Stay close," he murmured as they rode in. The camp was a collection of canvas tents and wooden platforms, with rails stretched like silver ribbons across the earth. Men in dusty work clothes paused in their labor to watch them pass. Charlotte kept her head down, conscious of her borrowed clothes and the way her heart hammered in her chest. They dismounted near the camp store, a weathered wooden structure with barrels lined up outside. As Taklishim negotiated with the shopkeeper, Charlotte's gaze fell on something that made her blood run cold. There, nailed to a post, was a poster with her face sketched in rough lines. "Missing," it declared in bold letters. "Charlotte Ray Wycliffe, reward $500. Below, in smaller print, distressed young woman. Return to Joshua Hartley, Bitter Creek Ranch." A group of workers had gathered, their eyes moving between the poster and Charlotte. One man elbowed another, whispering. Their gazes felt like physical touches, making her skin crawl. Taklishim appeared at her side, grain sack in hand. Without a word, he helped her mount up, his movements unhurried but purposeful. They rode out of the camp at an easy pace, though Charlotte could feel the tension in his shoulders. The sound of hoofbeats behind them confirmed her fears. Someone was following. Taklishim's hand moved to his rifle, but he kept their horses at a steady walk. Charlotte's heart pounded as she wondered what would happen next. The rail workers' pursuit ended with nightfall, thanks to Taklishim's clever backtracking through a maze of shallow canyons. As darkness settled over the land, he guided them into a deep arroyo, where steep walls offered protection from prying eyes. "Rest here," he said softly, helping Charlotte dismount. Her legs trembled from hours in the saddle. The dry stream bed provided soft sand for bedding, and the high walls blocked the wind that whistled overhead. Charlotte watched as Taklishim moved with practiced efficiency, laying out their bedrolls and starting a small fire in a hollow where its light wouldn't carry. He pulled dried meat and a canteen from his saddlebags, offering them to her without a word. "Aren't you going to sleep?" she asked, noticing how he positioned himself on a flat rock overlooking their camp. He shook his head. I'll keep watch." His rifle lay across his knees, a quiet reminder of the danger they faced. Despite her exhaustion, Charlotte felt safer than she had in weeks. She drifted off to the sound of night birds and the occasional soft nickering of the horses. Dawn broke clear and cold. They ate quickly and mounted up, Taklishim leading them along cattle trails and dry washes to avoid the main roads. Whenever they heard wagon wheels or voices in the distance, he guided them behind rock formations or into stands of mesquite until the travelers passed. As the sun began its descent, they came upon an abandoned line shack, a simple one-room structure with a sagging roof and empty windows. Taklishim checked inside before declaring it safe for the night. Charlotte sank onto a wooden crate, watching dust motes dance in the last rays of sunlight streaming through the window. "I used to dream about frontier life," she said quietly. "Thought it would be like living in a psalm, all glory and righteousness." She traced patterns in the dust with her finger. "Instead, it's become a battleground. Everyone fighting over every drop of water, every acre of grass." Taklishim nodded, understanding in his dark eyes. He moved to the hearth, clearing away debris before starting a small fire. From his saddlebag, he produced a handful of mesquite pods. "Come," he said, gesturing her closer. "I'll show you something." Charlotte watched as he demonstrated how to crack open the pods and extract the beans inside. He placed them in their small cooking pot with water. "Good medicine," he explained. "Makes you strong." While the beans boiled, he pulled a small tin of salve from his jacket. "For saddle sores," he said, offering it to her with characteristic discretion. Grateful tears pricked at Charlotte's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. After a moment, she added, "I miss singing hymns. Father always said music draws us closer to heaven." Taklishim stirred the beans, considering her words. Then, softly, he began to hum, a gentle melody that rose and fell like wind through canyon walls. It wasn't a hymn, but rather an Apache song that seemed to carry the very spirit of the desert in its notes. Charlotte closed her eyes, letting the unfamiliar music wash over her. When she opened them again, Taklishim was offering her a cup of the mesquite bean broth, his expression gentle in the firelight. Morning came too soon. They set out early, hoping to make good progress before the day's heat set in. The trail wound through rocky terrain dotted with barrel cactus and scraggly juniper. Charlotte was just beginning to feel comfortable in the saddle when a rattlesnake's warning buzz shattered the quiet. Her horse reared, throwing her backward. For one terrifying moment, she was airborne. Then strong arms caught her, breaking her fall. Taklishim had somehow dismounted and reached her in time, saving her ankle from a nasty twist against the rocks. They stood frozen for a moment, Charlotte's heart hammering against her ribs. Taklishim's hands were steady on her waist, ensuring she had her footing before stepping back. The snake had already slithered away, leaving only rattling echoes in their minds. "You all right?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. Charlotte nodded, still shaken. "Yes, thanks to you." She smoothed her skirt with trembling hands, while Taklishim calmed her spooked horse. Once she'd caught her breath and checked the horse for injuries, they continued their journey. But something had shifted between them. A deepening of trust, born of shared danger and quiet kindness. Charlotte found herself stealing glances at her companion, wondering at how this man, whom she'd first met in desperate circumstances, had become her most steadfast protector. The sun climbed higher as they pushed forward, each mile bringing them closer to Bitter Creek and whatever fate awaited them there. Yet Charlotte felt stronger now, fortified by mesquite bean broth and Apache songs, and the knowledge that she wasn't facing this journey alone. 2 days of hard travel left their mark on both riders and horses. Charlotte's hands were chapped from the reins, and even Taklishim's sturdy mount showed signs of weariness. They'd survived on jerky, mesquite beans, and what little water they could find in rocky hollows. The nights had been cold, spent huddled beneath overhanging rocks, always alert for sounds of pursuit. Now, in the golden light of late afternoon, Bitter Creek's church spire rose before them like an accusing finger against the sky. Charlotte's heart thumped harder with each step their horses took toward town. Taklishim guided them to an abandoned barn on the outskirts, its weathered boards providing decent cover while offering clear views of the town square. "We'll wait here," he said, helping Charlotte dismount. The barn's musty interior smelled of old hay and mouse droppings, but its walls blocked the wind, and its position gave them a perfect vantage point through gaps in the wooden slats. Charlotte settled near a hole in the wall, watching townspeople move about their business. Everything looked so ordinary, Mrs. Peterson hanging laundry, old Mr. Jenkins sweeping his store's porch, children playing marbles in the dusty street. It felt strange that life had continued unchanged, while her whole world had turned upside down. Her breath caught when she spotted a familiar figure by the saloon. "That's Emmett Hartley," she whispered, gripping Taklishim's arm. "Joshua's cousin." The ranch rider was lounging against the hitching post, hat tipped back, apparently sharing news with several cowboys. Taklishim studied the man's position and the routes in and out of town. After ensuring Charlotte was safely hidden, he touched her shoulder. "Stay here. I'll learn what I can." "Be careful," she said, fighting the urge to grab his sleeve and keep him close. He nodded once, then slipped out like a shadow. The hours crawled by. Charlotte dozed fitfully in the hay, starting at every sound. She watched the town's rhythm through her peephole, the afternoon stage arriving, women shopping at the general store, ranch hands gathering for supper at the cafe. Her stomach growled at the thought of real food. The sun had nearly set when Taklishim returned, moving so quietly she didn't hear him until he was beside her. His face was grim. "They think you drowned," he said softly. "Found your veil caught on river rocks downstream. Joshua Hartley's called off the search." He paused, then added, "But Deputy Ambrose doesn't believe it. He's still looking, asking questions about strangers in town." Charlotte shivered, remembering Ambrose's cold eyes and quick temper. The deputy had always made her uncomfortable, even during church socials. "Then we have to move quickly," she said. "The deed is still hidden under the pulpit. We need to get it tonight." Taklishim's expression remained neutral, but she saw concern in his eyes. "It's dangerous. Town's still awake." "Evening service will start soon," Charlotte explained, her mind racing. "Everyone will be inside the church, focused on worship. We can slip in through the back door. I know where Father kept the key." She pulled an old cloak from her travel satchel. "I can wear this. In the dark, no one will look twice." The church bells began to toll, calling the faithful to prayer. Through the barn wall, they watched townspeople making their way toward the white wooden building, women in their best skirts, men with their hats in hand. Charlotte's heart ached at the sight of her father's congregation. These people she'd known all her life, now somehow strangers. Taklishim watched the scene intently, noting guard positions and escape routes. Finally, he nodded. "We go when the service starts. But at first sign of trouble, we run," Charlotte finished. She pulled the worn cloak around her shoulders, tucking her hair beneath its hood. The familiar weight of the fabric gave her courage. "I'm ready." They waited until the last stragglers entered the church, then slipped from the barn like shadows. The evening air was cooling rapidly, carrying the scent of sage and cook fire smoke. Charlotte led them through back alleys she'd known since childhood, past sleeping gardens and empty corrals. The church stood tall against the darkening sky, its windows glowing with lamplight. Through the walls came the muffled sound of voices raised in song, "Amazing Grace," her father's favorite hymn. Charlotte swallowed hard against sudden tears. Taklishim touched her elbow gently, grounding her in the present moment. Together they crept toward the church's back entrance, where a simple wooden door waited. Charlotte reached for the loose board where her father always kept the spare key, praying it would still be there. Her fingers found cold metal. The key turned smoothly in the lock, just as it had hundreds of times before when she'd helped prepare for services. As the door swung open on well-oiled hinges, the sound of singing grew stronger, filling the air with familiar words of grace and redemption. They paused on the threshold, the moment of truth before them. Charlotte took a deep breath, steadying herself for what lay ahead. There would be no turning back after this. The heavy wooden door creaked softly as they slipped inside the church. Lamplight from the street filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across worn floorboards. The air inside smelled of beeswax candles and old hymnals. Charlotte's steps faltered as she passed the empty pews where she'd spent countless Sundays watching her father deliver sermons with passion and conviction. Taklishim moved like a shadow beside her, his moccasins silent on the floor. He kept watch while Charlotte approached the pulpit, the massive oak structure that had always made her feel small as a child. Now it loomed before her like a sentinel, keeper of secrets both spiritual and earthly. Her fingers traced the smooth wood where her father's hands had rested so many times. The brass candlesticks still stood in their places, though unlit. Everything was clean and orderly, but something felt different. The pews showed signs of regular dusting, yet they had an unlived-in quality that made her heart ache. No one had filled her father's role since his stroke. "Here," she whispered, kneeling beside the pulpit. Her fingers found the loose floorboard exactly where she remembered. It came up easily, revealing a dark space beneath. Charlotte reached in, feeling around until her hand touched cool metal. The tin strongbox was smaller than she'd imagined, about the size of a Bible. Faded letters spelled out "Revelation" across its lid. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out. "Someone's coming," Taklishim warned softly from the shadows. Charlotte quickly opened the box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay the Spanish land deed, yellow with age but intact. The formal script and official seals were clearly visible in the dim light. She carefully folded it and tucked it into her bodice. But something made her pause. "Wait," she whispered. "Father's Bible. I need to see it one last time." Taklishim's expression remained neutral, but his eyes showed understanding. Charlotte reached for the familiar leather-bound book that always sat on the pulpit. Its pages fell open naturally to Revelation, the section her father had read from most often in his final sermons. Her finger found chapter 22, verse 2. In the faint light, she read aloud. "On either side of the river there was the tree of life, bearing 12 manner of fruits, yielding its fruit every month, and the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations." To her surprise, Taklishim stepped closer. In a low voice, he repeated the verse in Apache, the words flowing like water over stones. Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes at the beauty of the familiar scripture in his native tongue. A sudden flicker of torchlight through the windows made them both freeze. Voices carried from the street, men on horseback, moving slowly past the church. "Back door!" Taklishim whispered urgently, taking her arm. But heavy boots were already climbing the church steps. Charlotte's heart hammered as she looked frantically around. Taklishim pointed upward, toward the belfry access. They moved swiftly through the shadows to the narrow staircase. Charlotte gathered her skirts, climbing as quietly as possible, while Taklishim followed. The wooden steps creaked despite their care. The belfry was tight quarters, smelling of old rope and bird droppings. They pressed themselves against the wall beside the great bell, barely daring to breathe. Below, the church door opened. Lamplight swept across the sanctuary floor. "Check everything," a gruff voice ordered. "Deputy Ambrose swears he saw movement in here." Charlotte recognized Joshua Hartley's voice. She clutched Taklishim's arm, feeling his muscles tense beneath her fingers. They watched through gaps in the floorboards as men searched the church, lifting pews and checking behind curtains. One man approached the pulpit. Charlotte's breath caught as he picked up her father's Bible, still open to Revelation. But after a moment, he set it back down carelessly. "Nothing here," someone called. "Just shadows and dust." "Keep searching the grounds," Joshua commanded. "She's got to be somewhere." Minutes that felt like hours passed before the men finally left. Charlotte and Taklishim waited longer still, listening to hoofbeats fade into the distance. Only when the night had fallen completely silent did they dare move. Descending was harder than climbing up had been. Charlotte's legs shook from tension, and the stairs seemed to creak louder than before. But they made it down safely, pausing at the back door to listen carefully before slipping out into the night. The deed pressed against her heart as they hurried through shadows toward their hiding place. Charlotte felt its weight like a promise, not just of land and water rights, but of justice and healing between peoples. The verse from Revelation echoed in her mind, first in English, then in Apache, binding their worlds together like the leaves of that ancient tree of life. Dawn painted the eastern sky in soft rose and gold as Charlotte and Taklishim prepared to leave their hiding place. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of sage and morning dew. They had chosen to take the Cottonwood Wash route back west, a longer path, but one less likely to be watched by Hartley's men. Charlotte's spirits soared as she helped pack their meager supplies. The deed was safely tucked away, and the danger of Bitter Creek lay behind them. She watched Taklishim adjust the saddle straps, his movements precise and practiced. "You know," she said, smiling as she rolled up their blankets, "I think I'll frame this deed right next to that beautiful carving of yours when we get back." Her voice carried a lightness she hadn't felt in weeks. Taklishim's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, his version of a smile. They mounted up and rode steadily through the morning, the horses' hooves raising small clouds of dust from the dry earth. By midday, they stopped near a riverbed that had long since gone dry. Charlotte spread out their simple meal while Taklishim built a small fire. The coffee he brewed was strong and bitter, but it went well with Elena's cornbread. They sat in comfortable silence, watching a red-tailed hawk circle overhead. As evening approached, they made camp beneath a vast canopy of stars. Charlotte sat close to the fire, wrapping her shawl against the cooling air. The flames cast dancing shadows across their faces as she gathered her courage to speak. "I've spent my whole life in church pews," she said softly, "searching for the peace that Father always preached about." She looked up at Taklishim. "But out here, with you, I found something different, something real." Taklishim reached into his leather pouch and withdrew something that caught the firelight. It was the piece of juniper he'd been carefully carving all these days. Now she could see its true form, a perfect circle with a hole through its center, smooth as glass, with intricate patterns carved along its surface. Her breath caught as he held it out to her. It was a ring. Tears welled in Charlotte's eyes as she took it, feeling the warm wood against her palm. The craftsmanship was exquisite, but it was the meaning behind it that made her heart swell. She slipped it onto her finger where it fit as if it had been made for her alone. The peaceful moment shattered at dawn. They had just mounted their horses when the first shot rang out. The bullet kicked up dust near Charlotte's mare, causing the horse to rear. More gunfire erupted from the rocks above them. "Ride!" Taklishim shouted, wheeling his horse around to shield her. Through the chaos of gun smoke and shouting, Charlotte heard hoofbeats approaching fast. A familiar voice called out, "Miss Charlotte! Behind you?" It was Mateo, Elena's son, riding hard toward them. But as he raised his arm to wave, a shot cracked through the air. Mateo cried out, clutching his arm as blood spread across his sleeve. His horse skidded to a stop beside them. In the confusion, Charlotte's saddlebag tore open. The deed fluttered out like a wounded bird, caught by the morning breeze. She reached for it, but more bullets zinged past. 3 riders emerged from behind the rocks, and one snatched the document from the ground. "No!" Charlotte screamed, but Taklishim held her back as more of Hartley's men appeared, rifles aimed. "Apache dog!" one of the men spat, training his gun on Taklishim. "We got you now! Stealing white women and church property!" "He didn't steal anything," Charlotte protested, but her words were drowned out by the sound of more horses approaching. Deputy Ambrose rode up with 2 other lawmen, their badges catching the morning sun. "Taklishim, you're under arrest," Ambrose declared, "for theft, kidnapping, and assaulting these good men." "That's a lie!" Charlotte moved to stand between them, but Taklishim gently pushed her aside. His face was calm as he raised his hands, though his eyes burned with quiet anger. "Don't make this worse," Ambrose warned as his men dismounted. They roughly pulled Taklisham's arms behind his back, binding his wrists with rope. Charlotte watched helplessly as they led him away. The juniper ring felt heavy on her finger as Hartley's men gathered around, the precious deed now clutched in their hands. Matteo sat slumped in his saddle, blood still seeping through his fingers where he gripped his wounded arm. The morning that had started with such promise now lay in ruins around them. As they led Taklishim toward Bitter Creek, Charlotte stood rooted to the spot, the taste of ashes in her mouth, where joy had been just moments before. Matteo slumped against a stack of burlap feed sacks, his face pale beneath his tanned skin. Charlotte pressed a wadded handkerchief against his wound, watching blood seep through the white cotton. They had found refuge in Whitaker's feed store, crouching behind towers of grain and cornmeal at the edge of town. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light that filtered through the weathered boards. "I'm sorry," Matteo whispered through clenched teeth. "I tried to reach you sooner." Charlotte shook her head, fighting back tears. "You risked everything to warn us. I'm the one who should be sorry." Her hands trembled as she checked his bandage again. The bullet had torn through muscle but missed bone, a small mercy in a morning that had held none. Hours crawled by like wounded things. They dozed fitfully among the feed sacks, starting at every creak and footstep outside. As evening approached, they heard the soft clop of hooves and the rattle of wagon wheels. "Someone's coming," Matteo hissed, trying to sit up straighter. Charlotte peered through a gap in the boards. Relief flooded through her as she recognized Elena's familiar figure climbing down from a wagon. She hurried to unlock the store's back door. Elena swept in like a warm desert wind, her shawl dusted with road dirt and her eyes fierce with worry. She carried a leather satchel of medical supplies and immediately went to her son. "Matteo, mihijo," she murmured, examining his wound with gentle fingers. She cleaned it thoroughly with whiskey and herbs, wrapping it in fresh bandages while Matteo bit down on a leather strap. When she finished, Elena turned to Charlotte, who had been watching with hollow eyes. Without a word, she pulled the younger woman into her arms. Charlotte broke then, sobbing against Elena's shoulder. "They took him," she choked out. "They took the deed. Everything we fought for." "Shh." Elena stroked her hair. "You're alive. Matteo's alive. Where there's life, there's hope." She pulled back to look Charlotte in the face. "And Taklishim is stronger than they know." The next morning dawned harsh and bright. Charlotte smoothed her borrowed dress, plain calico instead of wedding silk, and walked purposefully toward the courthouse. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her chin high as she climbed the wooden steps. The guard at the door barely glanced at her. "Court's not in session for common folk today." "I need to speak with Judge Morrison," Charlotte insisted. "It's about Taklisham's arrest. There are no formal charges." "Judge ain't seeing nobody," the guard cut her off, "especially not about that Apache troublemaker." Charlotte opened her mouth to argue, but the guard's hand moved meaningfully to his gun belt. She backed away, bitter frustration rising in her throat. As she turned toward the street, she saw Joshua Hartley emerge from the newspaper office across the way. He smiled when he spotted her, that same smooth, possessive smile that had once made her skin crawl. "Charlotte," he called out, "I knew you'd come to your senses. The wedding's still on for Sunday, Father insisted. All's forgiven." She didn't respond, didn't run. She simply walked away, her steps measured and deliberate, while rage burned in her chest. The jail sat at the edge of town, a squat adobe building with barred windows. Deputy Ambrose was dozing in his chair when Charlotte entered. He startled awake, hand going to his gun. "I want to see him," she said firmly. Ambrose sneered. "Ain't proper for a lady to visit jail cells." "Then I reckon it's good I stopped caring about being proper." She met his gaze steadily until he shrugged and led her back. Taklishim sat cross-legged on the dirt floor of his cell, as still as a mountain. His hands were still bound, but his eyes were clear and calm when they met hers. The deputy withdrew to the front room, leaving them alone. Charlotte gripped the iron bars until her knuckles went white. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. This is all my fault. If I hadn't dragged you into this—" "No." His voice was soft but firm. "But I failed. The deed is gone. They're still going to force the wedding. And now you're in here because of me." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Everything's broken." Taklishim rose in one fluid motion and came to the bars. Even bound, there was dignity in his bearing. "You are not broken," he said simply. Those 4 words hit her like a physical force. She saw herself reflected in his dark eyes, not as the preacher's obedient daughter or Hartley's claimed prize, but as something stronger. Someone who had dared to run, to fight, to choose. The juniper ring still circled her finger, smooth and warm against her skin. She touched it gently, drawing strength from its presence. "No," she agreed quietly. "I'm not broken." She straightened her shoulders, feeling steel enter her spine. "And this isn't over." Elena found Charlotte sitting alone on the feed store's back steps, twisting the juniper ring around her finger. The older woman settled beside her, smoothing her dark skirts. Above them, stars were beginning to pierce the purple dusk. "When I was your age," Elena began softly, "I loved a man named Thomas Miller." She touched the silver cross at her throat. "He taught at the mission school where I grew up. He saw me as more than just a half-breed girl, saw the teacher I could become." Charlotte turned to look at her friend's face, lined with memory and firelight. "His family threatened to have the mission closed if he married me," Elena continued. "Said it would be a scandal. He chose his reputation over love." She smiled, but pain flickered in her eyes. "I lost everything except my name and my faith, but that was enough to build a new life." "How did you find the strength?" Charlotte whispered. "I looked at what remained, not what was lost." Elena squeezed her hand. "You have more left than you know, mi querida." Later that night, Charlotte slipped away to the river's edge. Cottonwood trees rustled overhead as she knelt in the sandy soil. The water whispered past, dark and steady. "Lord," she prayed, her voice barely a breath, "I know I've strayed from the path others chose for me, but my heart tells me there's justice in what I seek." She touched the juniper ring. "Show me the way forward." She stayed there until her knees ached, listening to the river's song. As false dawn began to pale the eastern sky, memory struck her like lightning. She saw Taklishim on the trail, his strong hands carefully copying the deed's elaborate script onto a piece of paper. "In case," he had said simply. Charlotte rose, brushing dirt from her skirts. She hurried through the sleeping town to the livery stable. Their horses were still there, along with their gear. The stable boy was drowsy, but let her search through Taklishim's saddlebags. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped an oilskin packet tucked deep inside. There, rendered in careful charcoal strokes, was a perfect copy of the Spanish deed. Hope blazed in her chest. She found Elena preparing morning corn mush for Mateo. "The Territorial Land Office," Charlotte said breathlessly. "They could verify the copy, couldn't they?" Elena's eyes lit up. "Samuel Begay works there as a liaison. He's Apache, educated back east. He knows every land claim from here to Santa Fe." She set down her spoon and reached for paper. "I'll write to him now." The letter was simple but urgent, explaining Charlotte's situation and requesting immediate help. Elena sealed it with wax and pressed her silver cross into the cooling red pool. "The agency outpost is 2 days' ride east," Elena said. "Follow the sunrise and the railway cuts. Be careful. The Hartleys have men watching the main roads." Charlotte changed into riding clothes and packed light. Elena pressed dried meat, hard biscuits, and her own canteen into Charlotte's hands. "Go with God, mihija," Elena whispered, embracing her. "We'll watch over Taklishim." The morning was still young when Charlotte mounted her horse. She rode east through back trails and dry washes, keeping the railway's iron spine in sight, but staying hidden in the scrubland. The sun beat down mercilessly. She rationed her water and rode through the hottest hours, stopping only when her horse needed rest. That night she made a cold camp in a hollow between rocks, eating her biscuits slowly and watching for torchlight. The stars wheeled overhead, and she thought of Taklashim in his cell, praying he could feel her determination across the miles. The second day brought her through increasingly barren country. Her lips cracked from dust and wind. By late afternoon, she spotted the agency outpost, a cluster of whitewashed buildings with an American flag snapping above them. Samuel Begay's office was sparse but neat, with maps covering the walls and stacks of documents on every surface. He was an older man with silver-streaked hair and alert eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He read Elena's letter carefully, then studied Charlotte with quiet intensity. "Show me the copy," he said. Charlotte unwrapped the oilskin with reverent hands. Begay examined Taklishim's careful strokes, comparing them to other documents from his files. "The original Spanish grant is well known to this office," he said finally. "This copy matches our records exactly." He looked up at Charlotte. "Even the smudge in the corner, where the priest spilled communion wine in 1789. Relief made her legs weak. She sank into a straight-backed chair. "Miss Wycliffe," Begay said gently, "I will help you. Not just because Elena asks, but because I have seen too many false claims push good people from their land." He began writing in his precise hand. "We will need witness statements, survey markers, and water rights documentation, but first," he smiled slightly, "we must get your friend out of that jail." Charlotte touched the juniper ring, feeling its smooth strength against her skin. For the first time since the ambush, real hope bloomed in her heart. They had a chance, a real chance, to make things right. The morning sun cast long shadows as Samuel Begay led their small party westward. Charlotte rode beside him, while two agency clerks followed on sturdy ponies, their saddlebags heavy with legal documents. The late summer heat pressed down on them like a wool blanket, but Charlotte barely noticed. Her mind was fixed on Taklashim and the hope of justice. Around midday, a distant whistle echoed through the canyon. The group reined their horses to a halt as a locomotive rounded the bend, its black smoke marking the sky. Behind it stretched a long line of flat cars piled high with fresh-cut timber. "That lumber's bound for the dam site," one of the clerks remarked, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. "Railroad's been hauling loads like that for weeks now." Samuel Begay watched the train with narrowed eyes. "Interesting timing," he said quietly. "Very interesting indeed." Charlotte felt her chest tighten. "The dam they're planning, it would flood Bitter Creek, wouldn't it?" Begay nodded. "Which makes your Spanish deed even more significant, Miss Wycliffe." They continued riding through the afternoon, taking lesser-known trails to avoid the main roads. As the sun began to sink, Begay chose a sheltered spot near a spring for their camp. The clerks tended to the horses while Charlotte helped gather wood for a small fire. In the growing darkness, they shared a simple meal of beans and dried beef. The crackling flames cast dancing shadows on the canyon walls as Charlotte finally told her full story. Her father's stroke, the arranged marriage, discovering the truth about the Hartleys' plans, and her desperate flight that led her to Taklishim's fire. Samuel Begay listened intently, occasionally making notes in a small leather book. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, studying the fire. "The Spanish deed you carry," he said at last, "was granted in 1765. The Hartley claim dates only to 1842. He pulled out a folded map from his vest pocket. "But there's more at stake here than just who owns the water rights." The clerks leaned forward as Begay spread the map on a flat rock. By firelight, he traced the planned railway route with his finger. "The federal government has already approved funds for the dam project," he explained. "They've made promises to the railroad, to mining interests, to cattle barons like the Hartleys. But if your deed is valid, and I believe it is, it could stop the entire project." Charlotte wrapped her arms around her knees. "That's why they were so desperate to get me married off quickly. They needed control of the land before anyone could challenge it." "Precisely." Begay folded the map carefully. "Which is why we need the territorial commissioner himself to witness what happens next." This isn't just about one piece of land anymore. It's about exposing years of backroom deals and broken promises. The night grew cold, but Charlotte barely slept, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. At first light, they broke camp and rode to the nearest telegraph station, a small wooden building beside the railway tracks. Inside, Samuel Begay composed a careful message to the territorial commissioner. Charlotte watched as the operator's key clicked out their hope for justice, one letter at a time. Urgent stop Spanish land grant, 1765. Discovered stop Bitter Creek water rights in dispute. Stop request immediate presence to review documentation and witnesses. Stop matter affects federal interests. Stop. They waited as the reply came back, the operator transcribing each click. Arriving Bitter Creek 3 days stop. Maintain all documents secure. Stop witnesses ready stop. Relief flooded through Charlotte. She gripped the edge of the operator's desk to steady herself. 3 days, Begay said softly. Time enough to gather what we need. They parted ways at the crossroads, Begay and the clerks heading to the agency to prepare their case, while Charlotte turned toward Elena's mission school. The afternoon sun was starting to soften when she finally spotted the familiar adobe walls. Elena was sweeping the schoolhouse steps when Charlotte rode up. She dropped her broom and hurried forward as Charlotte dismounted. "What news?" she asked, gripping Charlotte's hands. "We have one chance," Charlotte said, her voice thick with emotion. "The territorial commissioner himself is coming. Samuel Begay says the deed could stop not just the Hartleys, but the whole dam project." She squeezed Elena's hands. "But we have to make it count. Everything has to be perfect." Elena's dark eyes shone with determination. "Then we will make it perfect." She pulled Charlotte into a fierce embrace. "God has not brought us this far to fail now." Behind them, the mission bell tolled the hour, its clear notes carrying across the desert. Somewhere in Bitter Creek's jail, Charlotte knew, Taklishim would hear it too. 3 days. They had 3 days to set things right. Word spread through Bitter Creek like wildfire. Charlotte Wycliffe was alive. The news rippled from the general store to the saloon, from the livery to the boarding house. Townsfolk whispered behind raised hands about the preacher's daughter who'd fled her own wedding. Joshua Hartley paced the church office, his boots marking angry circles on the wooden floor. "She's made a mockery of our family name," he snarled at his father. "We'll proceed with the ceremony today, before anyone else can interfere." Outside, the afternoon sun beat down on Bitter Creek's dusty main street as 2 Hartley Ranch hands dragged Taklishim from his cell. His wrists were bound, but he walked with quiet dignity, ignoring the hostile stares from townspeople. They forced him up the church steps, through the heavy wooden doors, and into a pew near the front. The small church filled quickly with curious onlookers. Elena and Mateo slipped in quietly, taking seats near the back. Mateo's arm was still bandaged, but his eyes were sharp and watchful. Charlotte stood at the altar, her face pale but composed, wearing the same wedding dress she'd fled in weeks before. This time, though, something had changed in her bearing. She stood straighter, her chin lifted slightly. Joshua strode to the front, adjusting his string tie with nervous fingers. The judge cleared his throat, preparing to begin the ceremony, when the chapel doors burst open with a bang. Samuel Begay entered first, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Behind him came the territorial commissioner, a distinguished man in a dark suit, followed by 2 agency clerks carrying leather document cases. "This ceremony cannot proceed," the commissioner announced, his voice filling the stunned silence. He held up an official-looking paper. "I have here evidence that invalidates any marriage contract between Miss Charlotte Ray Wycliffe and Joshua Hartley." Joshua's father surged to his feet. "Now see here!" "The Spanish land grant of 1765," the commissioner continued firmly, "predates all other claims to Bitter Creek's water rights. As her father's sole heir, Miss Wycliffe is the legal owner of this property." Charlotte stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. "I never consented to this marriage. It was arranged without my knowledge while my father lay ill. She turned to face the congregation. The Hartleys tried to steal my inheritance through forced marriage, but God's justice prevails over man's greed. The townspeople murmured, shifting in their seats. Elena smiled proudly from her place in the back pew. "This is outrageous," Joshua spluttered. "We have contracts." "Your contracts are void," Samuel Begay stated, producing more documents. "The deed Miss Wycliffe holds proves her claim. The Territorial Land Office recognizes her as the rightful heir." "Release him!" the commissioner ordered, gesturing to Taklishim. One of the clerks hurried forward with a knife, cutting the ropes that bound his wrists. Taklishim stood slowly, rubbing his wrists. His eyes met Charlotte's across the church, and something unspoken passed between them. The judge, red-faced and blustering, gathered his papers and stormed toward the door. "This is highly irregular. I'll be filing a formal protest." "File all you want," the commissioner replied calmly. "The law is clear. Miss Wycliffe owns this land, and any plans for damming Bitter Creek must go through her." Joshua Hartley's face twisted with rage. He took a menacing step toward Charlotte, but Taklishim was suddenly there, standing like a wall between them. Joshua backed away, his boots scuffing on the wooden floor. "The ceremony is canceled," Charlotte announced, her voice ringing through the chapel. "And I suggest the Hartleys leave my property immediately." The church erupted in whispers and movement as people began filing out. Elena and Mateo made their way forward, pride shining in their faces. Charlotte embraced them both, careful of Mateo's injured arm. "You did it, mi querida," Elena whispered, touching Charlotte's cheek. "You stood firm for what was right." Samuel Begay approached with the commissioner. "The official papers will be filed by sunset," he said, smiling slightly. "No one can challenge your claim now." The Hartleys departed in a cloud of dust and wounded pride, their ranch hands trailing behind them. The townsfolk lingered in small groups outside the church, discussing the morning's events in hushed, excited tones. Charlotte stood on the church steps watching the afternoon light play across the desert landscape that was now officially and irrevocably hers. Taklishim moved to stand beside her, his quiet presence as steady as the mountains on the horizon. The juniper ring he'd carved still hung from a leather cord around her neck, a symbol of promises yet to be spoken. The afternoon sun painted long shadows across Bitter Creek's courthouse steps as Charlotte stood beside Taklishim, her heart beating steady and sure. The chaos of the morning had settled into a peaceful quiet, broken only by distant windmills creaking and horses nickering at the livery stable. Charlotte reached for the leather cord around her neck, carefully untying it. The juniper ring caught the sunlight, its polished surface smooth from the hours Taklishim had spent carving it by firelight. She held it in her palm, remembering that desperate night when she'd first stumbled into his camp, terrified and alone. "If you'll still have me," she said softly, her voice clear in the autumn air, "I'll be your wife." Her eyes met his, steady and certain. Not for shelter, for life. Taklishim's expression remained calm, but his dark eyes softened. He nodded slowly, deliberately, the way he did everything. His large hand covered hers, closing gently over the ring. Elena, who had been speaking with Samuel Begay nearby, noticed the exchange. Her face brightened with understanding, and she hurried over to embrace them both. "Gracias a Dios," she exclaimed, wiping happy tears from her eyes. Reverend Thompson, who had witnessed the morning's events from his study next door, approached with measured steps. The elderly pastor had known Charlotte since she was a child, had served alongside her father for many years. His kind face creased with emotion as he cleared his throat. "If you're seeking God's blessing," he said, "I would be honored to perform the ceremony." He looked between Charlotte and Taklishim, adding gently, "A marriage born of love and respect is always welcome in his house." Charlotte's eyes welled with tears. "Thank you, Reverend," she whispered. Elena immediately took charge, her practical nature emerging through her joy. "We'll have a small wedding at the schoolhouse," she declared. "My students can help decorate. Mateo can ride to the reservation to invite Taklishim's people." She paused, squeezing Charlotte's hand. "And I have your mother's recipe for wedding bread." As the sun began to set, they made their way to Elena's schoolhouse on the edge of town. The simple wooden building glowed with lamplight, and the sounds of children's voices drifted through the open windows. Elena's students had stayed late when they heard the news, eager to help prepare for the celebration. Inside, Charlotte tied on one of Elena's aprons and began mixing flour for the wedding bread, just as her mother had taught her years ago. The familiar motions brought comfort, sifting, kneading, watching the dough take shape beneath her hands. Through the window, she could see Taklishim in the schoolyard with the children. A group of young students had gathered around him, both settler and native children together. He sat on a wooden bench, carefully showing them how to whittle small animals from pine branches. His hands moved with practiced grace as he demonstrated each cut, his patience evident in every gesture. One little girl presented him with a slightly crooked attempt at a rabbit, and his gentle smile made Charlotte's heart swell. The children began singing then, a mixture of hymns and traditional songs they'd learned from Elena. Their clear voices carried through the evening air, some in English, some in Spanish, some in Apache. The languages wove together like strands in a blanket, creating something new and beautiful. Elena appeared at Charlotte's side, adding a pinch of salt to the bread dough. "He will be a good father," she said softly in Spanish, nodding toward Taklishim. Charlotte's hands stilled in the dough. "Yes," she replied, watching as he helped a small boy position his hands safely on the whittling knife. "He sees people as they are, not as others wish them to be." She smiled, remembering how he had seen her true self that first night, beneath the torn wedding dress and desperate words. The sound of hoofbeats approached, and Mateo rode up to the schoolhouse. His injured arm was still in a sling, but he managed the reins well enough. He dismounted with a grin, calling out, "I found Wild Hank at the general store. He says he'll bring his fiddle for dancing." More townspeople began arriving, drawn by the children's singing and the news of the upcoming wedding. They brought dishes of food and offers of help, their earlier uncertainty replaced by genuine warmth. Samuel Begay spoke quietly with Taklishim about arrangements to bring his family from the reservation for the ceremony. Charlotte watched it all from the schoolhouse door, her hands dusted with flour, the juniper ring now properly settled on her finger. The simple wooden band felt right in a way no gold ring ever could. It spoke of patience, of careful crafting, of love that grew slowly and true, like the tree it came from. The children's songs filled the deepening twilight as lanterns were lit around the schoolyard. Their sweet voices carried the promise of tomorrow, of bridges built and wounds healed, of a love freely chosen under heaven's open sky. 3 days passed like a gentle stream, and on a crisp autumn morning, Charlotte and Taklishim stood beneath a towering sycamore tree by Bitter Creek's flowing waters. The tree's mottled bark caught the morning light, its broad leaves casting dappled shadows on the gathering below. Elena stood before them, her dark eyes bright with joy. She held both a worn Bible and a bundle of sacred herbs, bridging 2 worlds with grace. The morning air carried the sweet scent of wild roses that the schoolchildren had scattered along the ground. "In Ephesians," Elena began, her voice clear and strong, "we learn that love binds everything in perfect harmony." She spoke first in English, then Apache, then Spanish, each language flowing into the next like tributary streams joining a river. She lifted the herbs, speaking ancient blessing words that Taklishim's grandmother had taught her years ago. Charlotte wore a simple blue dress that Elena had helped sew, adorned with beadwork from Taklishim's sister. Her hair was crowned with a circle of desert flowers. Taklishim stood tall in his best shirt, a band of traditional symbols carefully embroidered at the collar. The children from Elena's school formed a half circle behind them, settler and native children standing shoulder to shoulder. At Elena's signal, they tossed flower petals into the air. The bright blooms caught the breeze, dancing around the couple like colored rain. Samuel Begay stepped forward, unrolling an official document. By order of the Territorial Commissioner, he announced, these waters shall be held in shared stewardship between the Apache people and Elena Garza's mission school. His voice carried across the crowd, where faces from town and reservation alike nodded in approval. Through the gathering, whispers spread that the Hartleys had packed their wagons before dawn, leaving Bitter Creek without farewell. Their disgrace had finally overcome their pride. As the sun climbed higher, Charlotte and Taklashim exchanged their vows, first in English, then in Apache. Their words mingled with the sound of the river, witnessed by earth and sky. Elena pronounced them married with tears in her eyes, blessing them in 3 languages. That evening, as celebrations continued around the schoolhouse, Taklashim sat quietly with Charlotte under the stars. From his pocket, he drew out a second ring he'd carved in secret. This one was pine, inlaid with tiny turquoise stones. With careful hands, he slipped it over the first juniper ring, the 2 bands fitting together perfectly. Like our 2 paths, he said softly, now flowing as one. Charlotte touched the rings, feeling the smooth wood against her skin. Around them, fiddle music mixed with traditional songs, and children laughed as they chased fireflies in the gathering dusk. 2 cultures danced together under the rising moon, their shadows merging on the schoolhouse walls. The weeks unfolded like pages in a well-loved book. Spring rains blessed the earth, and along Bitter Creek's banks, tender green shoots pushed through dark soil. Charlotte and Taklashim's garden flourished, nourished by the irrigation channels that wound like silver ribbons through the land. Apache farmers and settler families worked side by side, sharing water and wisdom across old boundaries. Each morning, Charlotte walked the path to Elena's schoolhouse, her steps light on the packed earth. Inside the sun-warmed classroom, young voices blended together as they sounded out letters and words. She moved between the wooden desks, helping small fingers trace the shapes of their first sentences. Native children taught settler children their words for rain and wind, while town children shared rhymes about cowboys and trains. Outside, the steady rhythm of Taklashim's tools marked time as he worked on the new fence. His strong hands shaped the wood with care, each post standing straight and true. Into the smooth rails he carved names, both English and Apache, marking the legacy of every child who passed through Elena's care. The fence grew like a living thing, telling stories in 2 languages. The town itself seemed to breathe easier. Merchants greeted Apache customers with respect, and Sunday services now included translations. Where harsh words once flew like arrows, people now nodded in passing, sharing news of rain and crops. Even the telegraph operator learned to say good morning in Apache. One evening, as purple shadows stretched across their small home, Charlotte lit the oil lamp. The warm glow caught the curves of the juniper rings on her finger, casting twin shadows on the wall. She began to hum softly. Amazing grace. The melody floating through the quiet room like a prayer. Taklashim moved from his carving bench to stand behind her. His hand, rough from honest work, came to rest gently on her shoulder. After a moment, his deep voice joined hers, weaving Apache words through the familiar tune. Their harmony filled the space between earth and sky. Through the open window, they watched Bitter Creek flow freely in the gathering dark. The water caught starlight and held it, each ripple a promise kept. The land that had once known only conflict now cradled peace, nurturing new growth and ancient wisdom alike. Charlotte leaned back against Taklashim's steady presence, feeling the rise and fall of his breath. In the lamplight's gentle dance, they stood together, not as property or prize, but as equals chosen and cherished. The creek's song drifted up from the valley, carrying stories of renewal to the listening stars. If something in this story whispered to your spirit, stay a while. Subscribe and come back tomorrow. The next story may be the one you didn't know you needed.